Have you ever thought about the relationship between money and lobby groups? It's a question I've thought about quite a lot, and I've always assumed that it's the richest lobbyists who are able to get what they want. In this episode, Florence and Michel interview Amy McKay, and she uses an ordered Logit regression to produce some quite surprising research.
Can you give us a short summary of your study and how you structured it, the main findings?
Okay, well, there were data on 776 lobbyists gathered through interviews with those lobbyists by some people. I didn't do those back in 1982-3. So I got a hold of those data, and then I enhanced them by gathering additional data on the interest groups being represented by the lobbyists, the employers of those lobbyists. And that was difficult because I had to go back in time and figure out the revenue of those groups in 1982 rather than today. So it was quite challenging. And then the other challenging thing I did was to come up with a measure of whether the group got what it wanted or not. And the original authors asked for respondents to say on a scale of 1 to 5, basically, how successful were you? And I went back and said, well, instead of asking them if they were successful or not, figure out if what they asked for is the same thing as what they got, what actually happened or not. And that led to, that was important because I think there's going to be some subjectivity in how successful people say they are. And that's why I wanted an independent measure of how successful they actually were, judging from what they said they wanted and then what actually happened. And so using those two additional pieces of data, and then all the variables that were already in the data, I asked whether groups that had more money are more likely to get what they want. And the data also allow me to ask some questions about intermediating factors like lobbying intensity and issue factor variables and lobbying connections. So maybe more money is not effective directly, but it's effective because it allows lobbyists to hire more lobbyists and lobby in more ways, in more time, in more venues, such as agencies and Congress, or allows them to spend more days per month lobbying, more hours per week, or more days in DC lobbying. So lots of different ways to control for intensity. And then measures of connections, like did they know lots of politicians? Had they worked in government before? Were they lawyers? Were they older? Had they been lobbying for very long? Did they know people on Capitol Hill? Did they know people in federal agencies? So using that array of really valuable information, I could say, well, maybe money helps groups do in their connections and in their intensity, and that allows them to become more successful. And the short conclusion is no. In most cases, money doesn't really matter. It does seem to help lobbying intensity a little bit on the margins, and greater lobbying intensity does seem to be linked to greater success, even when it's measured objectively.
So what motivated you to start looking at this area at lobbying and this connection?
Government today relies on lobbyists to tell it what the public wants, because the public doesn't tell it directly because they're too busy doing other things. And so lobbyists are really the voice of the people, and so we want to know if they are having an effect and what the size of that effect is, and whether it's fair that some lobbyists might be more effective than others. And in particular, the literature has suggested that lobbyists and groups with more money find it much easier to get what they want, and in effect, money runs Washington. And so I think that's a pretty imperative question for those of us interested in government in the U.S. Do moneyed interest groups just get whatever they want? Because that's pretty antithetical to the concept of a fair and open democracy.
Yeah. So just because it's an article about U.S., can you just please explain what a PAC is for those who are?
Sure. A PAC is a political action committee, and while it sounds like a group of people, it is really a means of giving money to political candidates. It's a legal way for a labor union or an interest group or a corporation to solicit money from its employees or its members, and then abide by pretty strict Federal Election Commission limits, and then distribute that money to federal candidates.
So what kind of connection or relationship do PACs have with lobbyists?
Very good question. They can be the same people, but they don't have to be the same people.
Could you please explain why you use a Logit regression?
Sure. So the lobbyists were asked on to say how many of their objectives they achieved, all, most, some, few, or none. And so that you can see is an order of from highest to lowest. And we don't know, we don't try to measure whether half is truly 50% of all, for example. We just leave it to the respondent to say. And then we use ordered logit because it's not a continuous variable where it can take on any value between 0 and infinity, or 0 and 5 even. It's going to be one of those integers. And that's appropriate for ordered logit in estimating the likelihood of between that the true value is in that range and where it is in that range.
So along like the same vein of the methods, what does ordinary least squares regression really mean, and why did you choose to use that type of regression for this?
I did that only for the models where I predict side success. So the side success measures everybody who said they were on the same side of the same issue. How successful did they say they were on that 5-point measure? And then I averaged that for all of them. So because it's an average, it can be anywhere in that range, from everybody that says no success to everyone says full success. And that's why it's appropriate for ordinary least squares regression, which is the standard tool that we use, and it's the simplest, most straightforward way of basically drawing a line between scattered points and finding the line of best fit. That's the way of looking of describing.
Okay. The data set you use, it's as you said, it's from the 80s, beginning of the 80s. Do you think that it still has, like, the research still has implications for today, or has there been a lot of change?
In my view, there hasn't been that much change. Yes, we have the internet. Yes, we have an increase in the number of money, the number of lobbyists, and the amount of money involved. But I would still say that the practice of lobbying, especially the personal talking to politicians, and also supplying money to their campaigns, is really not that different than from today. And these data are so amazingly good. 776 personal interviews they did, and it costs who knows how much money. Several different agencies funded it. That they needed to be looked at again, and I was glad to do that. Doesn't mean it's the definitive final study on this. In fact, its results are largely consistent with some other studies, but they don't control for the same variables I have, and every study has its differences. But I don't think there's any reason to believe the data don't are, just because they're old, they're no good.
The lobbyists in the interviews were asked to report their own success, and so it could have been quite subjective. Were there any measures that you took to address this subjectivity, or were you worried about the
Yes, that's why I used 3 different dependent variables.
Yeah.
So one is that success variable, and you're absolutely right, it is subjective. In fact, some of the findings in the data show that it's subjective in predictable ways, like businesses are more likely to say they were more successful, and public interest groups are more likely to say they were less successful. And I have some theories about that. Business depends on relatively small changes in regulations to increase its bottom line, and that equals success for a business. Public interest groups their goals are things like make the environment better, clear the air, stop global warming, and so it's much harder for them to achieve those kinds of goals. So to deal with that, I did 2 things. One is I did this objective measure. What's the correspondence between what they said they wanted and what they actually got? And then the other was to average all the success for different people who were saying, we all want this, this is our goal. And some of them say they achieve it and some say they don't. But this accounts for what your next question might be, which is, what if you were a little bit successful versus a lot successful? And that accounts for that, in my view, because it says, if we got 80% of what we want, then some of the respondents are going to say, yes, I was very successful, and some are likely to say, no, I wasn't successful at all, and so you average those and you end up with a number in the middle. And then those are the 2 alternative dependent variables in addition to the one you mentioned.
You used the lobbyist proposal as the unit of analysis rather than just the lobbyist or just the issue. Can you just expand on the reasons behind it?
Sure. And every lobbyist was asked about a list of policy proposals, and they selected up to 5 that they worked on most closely. And I was interested in the factors that help a proposal become law, and I had more than one opportunity, because every lobbyist would tell you, I was very successful on this and I was less successful on this, so I wanted to make that the unit of analysis, and that also made my N bigger. Took it from 776 lobbyists, or I think 76 issues, to up to 5 times that many. So in the end, it's accounting for the fact that not everyone worked on 5 different issues, and some people worked on fewer issues. Then the final number is close to 3,000 observations, which gives you a lot of leverage on using the statistical analysis.
Can you please explain the side success variable a bit more? So was it collinear with preferred outcomes, the relation between the 2, because they're quite similar? Yeah,
it's definitely collinear, and that's why I kept them separate at all times. I never put those in the same model. As I said, it accounts for the fact that some groups, whether you achieved exactly what you set out to achieve, doesn't mean isn't a full representation of how successful you were. You could have been, let's say you asked for, in the data there's an example of people who said they wanted to stop, there was the proposal to cut a certain grant, and instead Congress, actually the proposal was to eliminate the grant. And in the end, Congress cut it, but they didn't eliminate it. And so some people might have construed that as success and others not, and that's why it is good to have both measures in there. But I do think that the side success variable, which it varies from 0 to 5 continuously, is more useful than the dichotomous variable of did they get what they wanted or not. But it's useful to see that they're pretty highly correlated. Going back to another question you said, there were 776 lobbyists working on 5 different issues each, but there were only a total of 76 issues covered in the data. So obviously the people who work on the same issue have some corresponding effects because there was only one outcome. And similarly, if you're looking at money, the money that a lobbyist has is not going to vary across those 5 different issues that they dealt with. So that's when clustering for errors is very useful when observations are not independent, and yet you still want to test them, and so clustering makes the errors bigger, and therefore it's harder to find statistical significance for them. But since my findings were basically null findings, that money doesn't matter, then I thought it was prudent to also check for, to not do the clustering so that the errors would be smaller. And so I do that, and I don't find much of an effect even.
On the following page, you calculate a new variable called imputed money.
Right.
And just wondering what that represents and
okay,
why.
well, so these data were old, and it was hard to get some information, especially from private firms or private companies that don't actually have to reveal their revenue. So I relied on imputation, which is basically a way of using the fact that there are collinear variables, and so that money is related to other things, like whether the group is a business, and how many customers or members it has, how long it might have been in existence, and so forth. And so imputation uses all those collinear variables to predict money, the one I was interested in, the revenue, and that allows me to keep those cases in the data because I'm imputing or simulating or guessing or really making an informed guess as to what that number might be given those other variables that I know are collinear, because they're collinear for the other cases in which revenue is not missing. And that, as you might see, increases the n from 734 to 2,837. And the results are largely similar, so I think that's a fair thing to do. It's not complicated, it's transparent, it's done fairly often, and I did it in about a third of the cases for which I didn't have the revenue variable.
On the following page, page 913, you talk about sensitivity analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain more about what that is?
Yeah, it's just a fancy word for I checked. And it basically I tried some other variables, so along the way when you're doing research you make choices about how to measure certain things or how to control for certain things, what method to use, and what I'm saying in the sensitivity analysis means I'm checking whether my conclusions, my results are sensitive to those choices I make. And so the way you do that is you try the choices you didn't elect, and you see if you still get the same result. So for example, instead of taking the logarithm of the natural log of money, which has an effect of basically the super wealthy are not 100 times more effective than the little bit wealthy. It's a linear thing, and it makes the super wealthy more powerful than the non-wealthy, but not 10 or 100 times more wealthy. I tried with and without that choice, and I tried with and without using simulations to create errors, and I tried with and without I tried these 3 different dependent variables, and I tried imputing money and then not imputing money. So those are all sensitivity analyses, and while it does see, as you see in the table, that some variables are more significant when you do certain things, my general conclusions are not sensitive to those analyses.
Yeah, so the general image of lobbying is that it's something dangerous happening behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Did you consider the effect of such less transparent lobbying, or is that just a misrepresentation of reality?
Sure, well, all of the lobbying in these data is behind closed doors. None of this was videoed and coded as it was happening. So you are relying on the evaluations of individual lobbyists, but they were promised anonymity, and in fact I don't know their names. And because we're talking about the Carter and Reagan administrations, the questions don't ask, did you bribe? You know, they ask, did you take these particular actions? And then later I went back and said, oh, look, they were not successful. And so they could have lied about some of these things, but who's going to lie about whether they contacted a federal agency on a particular issue? Nobody has much incentive to lie about that, or whether they have previous experience in government, or whether they're a lawyer. So none of these questions are, if I ask them, did you bribe, then yeah, I suspect you would find some fibs in there, as my daughter puts it. But I don't think that desirability bias biases these results.
Do you take into account lobbyists lobbying just to get things on the agenda? It's like their agenda setting
Yeah.
function rather than actually
Well,
proposals.
That's an important point, and one that is really hard to test. So I've proposed a new project that looks at that, and we're planning to interview lobbyists and say, well, not just what are you working on now and how's it going, but what would you like to be working on if you could do anything you want? And so that's a new project I'm hoping to do with some international collaborators, because this study selected in advance the policy proposals that were already on the agenda, and they don't really detect that at all. So I think that's an important question that this study can't deal with, but that I hope to deal with in other work.
I think that question 18 we covered already. It's about that there might be more lobbyists working on one issue and how you account for it. But that is
Well, that's a tough thing. I don't know that any one lobbyist is responsible, and I don't think we could ever, it's even possible to know that. And politicians would of course say, well, I'm responsible, or the economy's responsible, or this was just a good proposal. So I don't think it's really accurate to say, well, who's responsible for it?
just to finish up. Would, if you had the opportunity to do the research again, is there anything you'd be doing differently?
Oh, I do have the opportunity to do research. I'm a full-time researcher, and so yeah, I'm following up the study with some other data. I've got new data on lobbying during the health reform proposal and debate in Washington in 2009 and 10, and I have additional lots of ways of measuring money, like how much they gave to particular politicians, not only PACs but individual lobbyists, and so that's one project. I have comments from interest groups on that bill and trying to link those with their money contributions and other ways of measuring their money, see if certain groups are more likely to get what they want because of money in a more varied way than this article uses. And then I'm also trying to focus on the agenda and how groups get their issues on the agenda in the first place before the stage of proposals that these data cover, and that may well be a function of money. And the one of the impetus for this study I'm talking about regarding agenda setting is the fact that the Baumgartner et al. 2009 book that is similar to what I have done and what the original authors did basically concludes, like I do, that money doesn't matter, and everybody thinks money must matter somehow. And so there, Baumgartner said, it's baked into the cake, meaning that the groups that are in Washington lobbying already have financial advantages that greatly outnumber the competition, whether it's just ordinary citizens who are unmobilized and unorganized, or public interest groups that are organized but not wealthy, that the groups that are active in Washington lobbying are already financially way ahead of other groups, and therefore it doesn't really matter. It's like what another author put it as, shouldn't matter who clears the chips off the table at the end. It matters, who collectively has the most chips, and this kind of a study doesn't well account for that. So I'm hoping to do more work where I get a picture of what happened before the proposal gets made, rather than after.
The first lesson to learn from the interview with Amy is that she used ordered logit regression, and that this is the best type of regression model to use when you have an ordinal variable. It's a bit difficult to explain what an ordinal variable is for those of us who aren't aware of it, so I'm going to just draw a little picture on the board here for you. So basically her answer options varied from not at all over to something that pretty much means completely, with some intermediate options in between, and this measures the lobbyist's self-perception of their success. The reason we say it's an ordinal variable rather than a scale variable is because the gap between not at all and the next category along is not necessarily exactly the same as, say, the gap between almost completely and completely, but there is some order in the way the variable is measured. A second lesson is that it's useful to do what's called clustering errors, where you have group effects that are non-random. So in this example, Amy clustered her data according to the grouping variable, which was issue. And this is in recognition of the fact that it may be easier to be successful with lobbying on some issues than it is on others. A third lesson that we learn from Amy's paper is about the pros and cons of collinearity. Now, collinearity can be a really bad thing if you input two variables into a regression model and they kind of cancel one another out and give you inaccurate records of your standard errors. However, collinearity can also be really useful in that one thing it can allow you to do is to impute variables, and that is to fill in missing gaps in your data series by using variables that are similar to predict those gaps, which can increase your sample size and make your analysis more viable. Lesson number 4 from the interview with Amy is that intervening variables can help us fill in incomplete parts of a story. So although there was a strong relationship between money and lobbying success in Amy's work, she added additional variables to show that it's not money per se that is the key predictor of lobbying success, but instead the amount of intensity that goes into the lobbying effort. The fifth lesson is related to the fourth one. We might want to doubt the reliability of these findings if we don't believe in the way in which the variables have been operationalised. Do we think that the variable imputed money is an accurate measure of the amount of money that the lobbyists actually had? Secondly, the way success is measured is by participants' self-assessment of their success. We may not believe that measurement of success. So it's worth thinking about whether we believe or have faith in the way these variables have operationalised in order to consider how seriously we want to take the research findings.